Chris, can you break down the testing process for a cannabis product from intake to final certification?
Sure. So from the intake portion, once the sample reaches the lab, there's a transfer of custody, which is a sign-off between obviously our drivers and the lab itself. We do all this digitally so the customer has real-time access to the transfers of custody and be able to track samples to and from the facilities. Once that happens, it gets checked in, it gets photographed, there's a QR code assigned to the product. That QR code follows it through its entire life cycle in the lab. You have lab technicians who then weigh out samples. The first sample that's taken is for micro to avoid any cross-contamination of the sample. And then from there, potency and pesticides, heavy metals, residual solvents as needed, and terpenes are sampled out, and then an extraction happens, whether it's liquid. If they're gummies, sometimes we put them in a negative 80-degree freezer to freeze them and then powderize them. But then a liquid extraction is completed, depending on how long it has to be extracted for, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, depending on the method. Then those samples are pipetted out. A retention sample is prepared. One is prepared for the sample itself to be run in the instrument. And then, typically depending on the method, it could be anywhere from like a 45-minute run time to an hour, depending again on the analysis that's being performed. But from there you have an analyst who reviews that data, reviews the chromatography, and then transposes that information onto a COA. And then the COA is reviewed by, so we have a 3-step process, so it's quality controlled, compliance looks at it, and the lab directors do a final sign-off.
What are the key differences in testing for THC, CBD, and minor cannabinoids?
I think for the most part, the tech stack that everybody uses is an HPLC. I think some of the challenges are the way people extract them. Some of the challenges are the products themselves. There's constantly new products hitting the market, so the approach isn't really the same for a lot of these new SKUs that are coming out. So it's really being flexible enough and able to adjust based on the products that are being sent to the market. But what really sets aside is the standards that everybody's using, right? I think that's a big part of the challenge in this industry. There's anywhere from 20 to 25 different vendors who provide those standards, and in terms of the way they're prepared and the stability of the analytes inside of those standards, it really swings results for customers across the different industries, across the different markets. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges behind potency testing today.
How do different product formats, such as flour, edibles, concentrates, beverages, etc., impact testing procedures?
In terms of approach and how they're...
Yeah, like is there differentiation based upon what the product is, if it's flour or if it's a concentrate?
Or how much you have to test? Like I know in flour, I think you have to test something like 15 grams or something like that.
Yeah, so that's a great point. In terms of how much product actually has to be sampled in preparation to test the sample, one of the challenges that we have is the batch that's being sampled is the sample size that we're selecting is representative to the batch size. And sometimes, and depending on the market, it could be anywhere from 10 or 15 grams up to 20 grams, but the harvest is a few hundred pounds. So we're taking a small subset of a huge harvest and making that representative of the entire batch sometimes is challenging for sure.
Are there specific challenges in testing infused beverages compared to traditional edibles?
Some of the challenges that we've seen really is surrounding the sourcing of, like, let's say the cans, for example, right? Some of them have liners inside of them, and based on the way that the operator makes their beverages, we've seen cannabinoids stick to the side of the liner. So when you do a sample size, we know what's going into it, right? And there's obviously a label on it. So a lot of the times when we do our rinse, if you don't use a certain solvent, you leave cannabinoids stuck to the liner, and then it's not representative of the actual result of what's in the product. So just little challenges like that we found along the way, and everybody's sourcing their goods from different areas, right? And sometimes these operators will change a particular product type that they're sourcing and not notify the lab. We're moving through hundreds, if not thousands, of samples in a day, and all of a sudden we get a phone call from a customer, hey, this, the product's not meeting spec, right? But nobody notified us, that there was a change in these particular cans, right?
Where does stabilization play into that?
Do you mean like stability studies?
Yes.
Some states require it. I think that's ultimately going to get us to a point where products can have an expiration date of 6 months or 12 months or 24 months, depending on the product type. We're seeing a lot of operators starting to request this type of testing, right? Because product is sitting on the shelf in certain markets. So having visibility into what that looks like, I think, is definitely something that we're starting to facilitate a lot more often. But relatively speaking, like in a pharmaceutical environment, a typical test like that can range anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000, and in the cannabis space, you know, that would be like a no-fly zone, right? So we. You know, we price it accordingly, but it's definitely, you know, something that we're seeing more often for sure.
What are some of the most concerning contaminants you frequently detect, and how do they impact consumers?
So, in all fairness, you know, one of the ones that comes to mind is you know, pesticides are on everything, right? They're on our produce, and you know, it's definitely something that we need to be vigilant, especially in markets where we utilize them. But sometimes I feel like we test cannabis like we're testing Ebola, right? So it's good enough to be in our vegetables, but you know, then you know, we're testing at a huge limits, you know, on cannabis. So again, it's for me, testing is there to provide visibility into what's going on, and then the operators should make the best, you know, decision possible for themselves. But you know, the state regulatory body from state to state is different on every type of pesticide. So it's really like, you know, I'm sitting here sometimes saying we want to be really safe for our patients in, you know, say Florida, right. But in other markets, you know, it's not as important because the limits are not as stringent. So, you know.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.